Beginning transmission. This is the Chaos Community Broadcast, a show about failures and how to navigate socio-technical complex systems so you can surf the chaos instead of succumbing to it. For recording of this episode, as well as all of our previous broadcasts, you can go to chaos.community and get access to them there. You can also check us out on YouTube, and if you're a subscriber to us, we'd really appreciate that. I'm your host, James Wickett.
And I'm your other host, Casey Rosenthal.
Well, hey, today we're pausing from our series on the book, Chaos Engineering, a System Resiliency in Practice. And we have with us today Liz Fong-Jones, who's a principal developer advocate at honeycomb.io. Liz, we're really excited to have you on the show today.
Hello, thank you for having me on the show.
Yeah, Liz, I'm really excited to have you on, in particular because of the confluence between chaos engineering and observability. I mean, one of the reasons that I think we end up speaking at a lot of the same venues is because organizations are getting to a point, they're coming to the realization that it's not enough to try to avoid complexity. That's a feature of the software systems that we run at scale. And so now they're looking for ways to operate, maintain, and navigate the complexity that they're stuck with, essentially. And so chaos engineering is a tool in that space. A bunch of exciting companies in that space, and I think observability is definitely one of the pillars of how these companies can navigate the systems at scale that we're all dealing with now. Do you see a similar convergence there?
I think that it's really critical for you to be able to see and understand what you're doing before you even do anything else. If you can't measure the changes to your system that you're making, then you're going to be hopelessly lost. You don't know whether you're driving in circles.
Sorry, James, it actually lists you as having the next. You're asking questions?
So imagine you're in a large enterprise and, for some reason, maybe you haven't been paying attention to what's been going on in the industry for a while. And then all of a sudden you realize that all your monitoring tools are now called observability tools. And how do you, as one of these people, how do you sort of feel like, don't have the feeling of like, hey, who moved my cheese and why am I now just stuck with this observability thing? Can you unpack that?
I think that question is predicated on a couple of misleading assumptions. First of all, it is true that companies that have previously been selling monitoring solutions are attempting to rebrand themselves as observability. But I think that for your enterprise that has been using these monitoring tools, the rename has done absolutely nothing to change what those tools are doing if you are stuck using legacy tooling. So I think that is part of the reason why there are a lot of folks who say observability is hype, observability doesn't actually do anything differently, right? It's because people are just rebranding in place. We saw the same thing with DevOps, where people would practice the same old shit and then they'd just slap the DevOps or SRE labels on them and say, it's now SRE or DevOps, right? I think that the place where companies realize that they do need something different than what they've been traditionally sold or building in-house is when you get to that point of having chaotic, complex systems, as you're saying. Right, at that point, no amount of measuring your known unknowns will help you navigate your unknown unknowns. And I think that that's where people start seeing this need, regardless of what you call it, for solutions that involve being able to ask any question, to be able to unpack and understand exactly what's happening with your unknown unknowns.
And so, would you consider LightStep as operate? Are they a true observability platform? So how do you plan on destroying LightStep?
So I think there are a number of companies that are rebranding older solutions. So things like New Relic, things like Datadog, things like Splunk, where they have existing solutions that kind of fit into this 3 pillars model that they're pushing, right, around logs, metrics, and traces, where they've added these functionalities of each additional pillar that they claim that you need based off of product acquisitions that they've made, right? We've seen Datadog acquire a logging platform in the past 5 years. We've seen New Relic make its own kind of product development. We've seen Splunk acquire Omnition. Whereas I think that there are tools that have been built from the ground up. Indeed, you see things like LightStep and like Honeycomb that were kind of built from day one to ingest trace data as their first and foremost kind of event, with the understanding that you can build a log out of a white event. You can build a metric out of a white event, but you cannot reverse engineer a white event out of a metric that you've already pre-aggregated. So kind of in that taxonomy of can you understand unknowns, I think that definitely LightStep is a very strong product there. And I think that the other solutions that are kind of made up of this legacy 3 pillars, accretive model, are going to struggle a little bit more with disparate data models, confusing pricing. But that's not to say that you can't eventually get there. It's just a question of how complex it is. So I think, was your product's data model built correctly? And I think that, LightStep is a very strong product. And honestly, I don't think that I'm worried about trying to, in your words, Casey, destroy LightStep. I don't want to destroy LightStep, right? Like I would like to grow the pie rather than take pieces of the pie from other people.
Can't always listen to all of Casey's questions, Liz, there.
So my follow-up question was going to be why are logging companies so wrong? But I think you answered that. And hey, I'm a fan of high cardinality events. Netflix has a system that's similar in spirit. And so like Charity often says in her presentations, once you have kind of a taste of that kind of tool operating system at scale, it's really difficult to imagine going back to not having access to tools like that.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. As I was talking about what's wrong with metrics tools. I hadn't really talked about what's wrong with logging tools, and I think that the primary thing that's wrong with logging tools is just that the data is not structured enough, right? Like you can't slice and dice, you can't transform those kind of log events into more structured data and into the metrics, into the heat maps, into the visualizations, and into the trace data. And I think that, when you have a company that is kind of swishing around, right, like sloshing around between, we're using logs, now we're using metrics, right? Like, and it turns out the sweet spot is actually somewhere in between, but people wind up going from one extreme to the other and then treating them as separate data types, right? And I think that that's kind of a mistake. So I'm actually not that opposed to logs, right? Like, I think that logs are a great starting point if you apply structure, if you start treating them as white events.
Is there a way to take a tool like that, high cardinality events, and apply it to 2020 to figure out why the year is so broken?
I think that we have a lot of the signals we need about why things are so broken. I think that I read this really interesting article in The Atlantic about what would happen if you took a NTSB report approach to the coronavirus crisis, right? And you would say, this was a controlled flight into terrain. How did you wind up with this controlled flight into terrain? All of the sensors worked perfectly, right? But the people who were interpreting the output of the sensors didn't want to listen to them. So I actually think that we have the necessary tooling here, right? Like to understand the data. And I think that it's how people reacted that requires a completely different approach that is not actually tool-centric. It's socio-technical system, kind of social first.
You're based in New York, correct?
I used to be based in New York. I moved to Canada about 2.5-3 weeks ago. So I finished my quarantine a week ago, and I am now in Vancouver, BC as of last week.
Oh, congratulations. So you're up in the Straits of Georgia there, I take it? Vancouver area?
Yep, I am in downtown Vancouver. It is very similar to and yet very different from New York.
Very, very cool. I haven't been up that way in years. Last time I was out in that part of the Pacific Northwest, I was doing some work with the IWW up in Everett. There was a Sheriff McRae who was mistreating some shingle workers who were going on strike. And so he basically deputized a bunch of goons in town. And about 300 of us or so showed up in Seattle and got aboard the Verona steamship, went up to Everett to help them. And so as we were pulling in, Sheriff McRae was there on the pier, and he yelled out as we threw a plank out, he yelled out, "Who's your leader?" And of course, we were a bunch of Wobblies, so we all yelled back in unison, "We're all leaders here." There was this pause. And
I can't tell, Casey, whether this is a story from one of your talks or whether this is something that actually happened to you, because your life is really that fascinating.
And then big chap. He was standing next to Chance Wyman, the pilot. He started walking towards the plank, and the sheriff said, "Well, you're not allowed to dock here." There was another pause, and he said, "The hell we can't." And so, of course, they started shooting, and it went down as I think it's recorded as the Everett Massacre. But anyway, so what are your thoughts on unionizing software engineers? I mean, presumably now that you're in Canada, you're safe from persecution here in the US. So what do you think about organized labor and software?
I think that for many, many years, the bosses have basically tried to tell software engineers, hey, you're professionals, we're going to pay you really well, we're going to give you all of these perks, like, don't worry about all the labor stuff. And I think that it's only recently that people have started seeing through this. And I think especially the people who were first to call out that, hey, like, not everything is in happy land, were the people who were still being denied promotions, still being denied fair pay, the black women, the black folks, the women, the non-binary folks, right? Like, and I think that those are the first people to raise alarms, saying like, hey, like, sure, you may be being paid a lot, but we aren't, right? So I think there's kind of this growing class consciousness of us as tech workers being workers, right, rather than the tech being the first part. So I think there are a couple of different avenues here, one of which is that many of the things that we technologically innovate wind up having real world implications, right? If you think about the fact that Amazon workers, right, like a majority of Amazon workers are actually the warehouse workers, right? So I think there is growing room for solidarity between kind of the software engineers at Amazon and the warehouse workers as both workers who work in tech for Amazon. And I think the other angle is that even beyond the kind of physical realm, there are also concerns about what happens with data, right? Like how is our data used? What's the privacy concerns related to that? And what are our ethical obligations as software engineers? So I think both of these factors lead us towards kind of this idea of unionization as one possible solution to deal with both kind of problems of bad workplace conditions, bad pay, as well as working on the wrong things that are taking us in the wrong direction.
So do you think we should be pushing towards a union for software engineers, or more specialized than that, or a larger organization like the Wobblies?
I think that, as you were saying with kind of the Wobblies as this organization where we're all leaders, right? Like there's no kind of central leadership. I think that is a really, really excellent approach because we've seen tech companies retaliate against prominent leaders, both in terms of retaliating against warehouse workers who are the first to raise alarm about COVID infections in their warehouse. But we're also seeing where they're retaliating against people like Lawrence Bernard, right? Like people who raised awareness of, hey, LGBT plus people are being mistreated by YouTube's policies, right? So I think that the more decentralized you can make your movement, the better. And I think also that a traditional union requires 50% plus one of a given category of worker to give a shit. And I'm a little bit burnt out and cynical of that. When you've got a workforce that's been constructed to favor and privilege white men who make up a disproportionate number of your workers, right, it's going to be really challenging to get that many folks to care about people who look different than them, right? It's going to be challenging to get that 50% plus one if more than 60, 70% of your workforce is still white and Asian men who, that don't personally suffer from a lot of the same issues that people who are more marginalized do. So one of the things I'm actually working on right now is something that we announced a couple weeks ago. It's called the Coworker Fund. And it is a collaboration between me and the folks at coworker.org who have been kind of acting as this organizing resource for workers who are both tech employees as well as people who are working in non-traditional working environments, like the Uber drivers, right, where they're all considered independent contractors, or Starbucks workers across many different franchise locations, right, where there's no one union that'll cover all of them, right? So the idea that we had was, how do we enable people to speak up without fear of retaliation, right? Like what happens if there are attempts to fire workers? What happens if workers feel like they can't afford to take time off or if workers feel like they can't afford to go on strike? How do we support them? And the answer is that, tech employees do make a lot of money. Let's start fundraising from tech employees to establish a solidarity fund, to establish a strike fund.
The American City Multi-Control Stanchion. It makes them stop. Control traffic manually or automatically at intersections. Catalogs are available upon request. Just write to 145 Frayling-Hoyson Avenue in Newark, New Jersey. That's the American City Multi-Control Stanchion. Okay, there you go, Casey. Relevant.
You know, I used to manage a traffic team.
That's is that how you got this spot?
Yeah, I'm actually feeling fortunate today because I can't hear you, James. So it's fortunate.
Yeah, I think it's really, really interesting. One of the teams at Google is called Traffic SRE, and they manage the flow of internet traffic and packets throughout Google's routers and systems. And one of the fascinating incidents that I worked as incident commander at Google was the outage in July of 2018, where Google Cloud dropped something like 99% of incoming traffic for 30 minutes.
And Liz, I appreciate you kind of taking over the mic there while Casey's being rude to me. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
What work are you most proud of?
What am I most proud of? I think that I continue to be really proud of the efforts that I supported in my time at Google with regards to opposing Project Maven at Google, because that was a situation in which engineers were, without their knowledge, being conscripted into having their work used to target drone strikes in the Middle East. And I hear people say, if you don't build it, someone else will, or hey, if you don't do this, then we're going to hit more innocent people. And honestly, that's all bullshit, right? The outcome that we achieved was that Google withdrew its bid for Project Maven, right? Withdrew its bid to build classified data centers for the U.S. Department of Defense that were not audible, that you couldn't actually verify is the government doing what they say they're doing and only using it for, purpose X or purpose Y, right? And I think the fact that I and many other Google workers put a stop to that meant that Google and we were not complicit in that. And my hope is that more and more workers will be able to follow that example and say no to unethical contracts, for instance, with ICE, but also with the U.S. Department of Defense, as well as with totalitarian regimes such as the People's Republic of China and the repression against dissidents and repression against ethnic minorities that's happening right now in the PRC.
Yeah, that is amazing work, and I sincerely thank you for doing that great work.
Yeah, so I think, right now my challenge is how do I scale that, right? How do I make it so that I am not a single point of failure, that no one activist is a single point of failure? How can we support those efforts at more companies?
If you couldn't work in software, what would you be doing?
I think, honestly, labor organizing, but not necessarily in software, right? I think that we are at this really, really pivotal moment where we have a oligarchy or this kind of what's the word for it? Where you have plutocracy, right? It's this moment where we can choose to resist the plutocracy, or we can just stand by and do nothing, right? So I think it's kind of that. I'm also really, really focused on advancing transgender rights because goodness knows the world has evolved in the past 20 years, right? I came out 19, 20 years ago, and things were bad then, and things have a possibility of backsliding to as bad as things were then or even worse. So how do I help people?
I just have one last question. This is a technical one. What can we do to discourage the adoption of SRE practices?
What can you do to discourage the adoption of SRE practices? Well, the simplest thing that you can do to discourage the adoption of SRE practice is to adopt a blameful attitude, right? To say, you're not doing it right, or you should adopt an SRE center of excellence, or else you're doing it wrong. You should, we're going to achieve this number of nines, or else we fire all of you, right? I think that's the number one thing you can do to discourage adoption of SRE.
Center of adoption. For SRE practice, Center of Excellence. There we go.
I was going to say, Liz, you just armed Casey with a list now. It's great. Thank you.
Oh no, what have I done?
James, do we have any call-in questions?
Let's get our first caller in here on the line.
Hi, Liz. I know that you have a preference for dogs personally, but I wondered if you could better help us understand SRE by maybe suggesting what kind of animal would be most analogous to an SRE. Maybe a type of bird, a horse, maybe a wallaby?
I think that's a really great question. Thank you for phoning that in, Kurt. So I think that the best kind of animal to represent SRE is the are the little cleaner fishes. You know the ones that on in the deep sea. You have animals that swim along and their mouths get filled with awful stuff, right? So you've kind of got these cleaner fish that will go and clean out the mouths of those other fish to help them function better. I think that's kind of a really good representation of how SRE should work, right? To make the systems better. You don't go at it alone. You kind of cooperate and help other people.
Come on, James, you had all that time to line it up.
Don't heckle me. I had it all lined up. All right, here we go. I'm just slow with the computers.
Yeah, hi Liz. Big fan. Long-time listener, first-time caller. Say, is there a way to configure Honeycomb to only work 6 days a week? We follow the best practices, so we shut off all of our CI/CD tooling on Fridays. Since nothing changes that day, we don't need Honeycomb running that day. And can we automatically save 14% of our costs that way? We're currently on the free tier. Thanks, love you.
Hi, Charity. So the way that you can save 14% of your bill is indeed to shut off your servers for the entire weekend. The problem with that is that you're going to find it a little bit challenging to turn them back on the next morning, because unless you've carefully checked to make sure that you don't have any circular dependencies, you may find that your services can't restart without dependencies upon other services. It's kind of this really complex web. So map out all of your dependencies before you start doing that kind of aggressive testing is my advice.
Liz, thank you so much for joining us on the show. That was great.
Thanks. It was an absolute pleasure. It was very fun.
Liz, really appreciate having you on the show. And Casey, as always, this concludes our show of the Chaos Community Broadcast. And we hope that you tune in for future broadcasts. If you'd like access to them, go to chaos.community, and the web browser of your choice also works on mobile. And if you're on YouTube, we would really like a subscribe to our channel and a thumbs up on the video. For now, that concludes this broadcast.